Well, there's a couple things up here, and they're very important things. There's a guy named Gaius Populus. It's Latin. Gaius Populus. It's his last name. It's almost there. Lianos. He was a warrior in Rome about 170, 80 AD. And then he became a senator. He had an injury on his leg, and so he often would have a cane with him. This is early days of Rome, during the time before there were emperors, when the Senate, Senatus, ran things. And Gaius Populus was called to go and deal with the situation with a man named Antiochus IV. Do you remember at Christmas time I did a sermon on the 9 lights of Hanukkah? Remember that? You remember the king who had persecuted the Jewish people so much that they even had to sacrifice pigs on the altar? And remember at the end when finally that king was ousted, that Greek king was ousted, then they had the service of dedication, and there was only 1 day's worth of oil, and it burned for 8 days straight. Remember that? And that's why the dedication message that God is our oil of life. He is the one that does it. But Antiochus IV, called also Epiphanes. Do you know what Epiphanes means? Epiphanes means God appearing. He had a high estimation of himself. That was the king, Antiochus. When he was forced out of Israel, he was forced down toward the Mediterranean, around the area of Gaza, and they started heading the other direction. And there was another Greek kingdom called the Ptolemy kingdom. It's spelled P-T, Ptolemy. You know Queen Cleopatra? She was Ptolemy. She was Greek. Ptolemy, even though she looks Egyptian, in the pictures, because she wore the Egyptian costumes. And she was one of the only royalty that were Greek that had learned the Egyptian language. She had learned it quite fluently. But the Ptolemies were south. Now, this wasn't at the time of hers. She was young at this time, very young at this time. So this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, from the Seleucid kingdom of Greece, he comes down with his armies after being whooped in Judah, coming down in Israel, what we call Israel today. He comes down and he starts messing with the Ptolemy kingdom. Now, the Ptolemy kingdom and Rome had a special pact between them. Rome was busy in a war, but just at the end of that war, they started receiving word from Egypt that this Seleucid king that's supposed to hang out in Babylon is messing and trying to take over Alexander. Well, of course, the Seleucid king says, I'm going to take over Alexander. I'm Alexander the Great. I am Antiochus Epiphanes. I am God appearing. Well, the Ptolemies didn't like that, and neither did Rome. And that's where Populus, senator now, Populus comes with his envoy from the Senate. He had the tiles with him, with the edict from Rome, specifically asking Antiochus to leave Egypt and go back where he belongs. Go back to Babylon where you belong. Well, this old senator, warrior, came. And Antiochus, as always, was so happy to see him. This is about 165 BC. This old senator comes with his cane, as he has the troops with him, as it would be, right? He's an envoy from the Senatus of Rome, Romanus. He comes, and he has the plates with the edict from Rome to him. And of course, Antiochus puts his hand out to shake the hand of Populus. And Papulus goes like this. First, I will deliver the message to you. And he hands the message. And Antiochus says, what's this all about? You know, Antiochus, he's Epiphanes, right? He's awesome. Isn't he God appearing? He just lost in Israel, and now he's messing, terrorizing the guys in Egypt. As Antiochus IV is reading these tablets, which state that you will immediately evacuate from Egypt and stop messing with the Ptolemy. I mean, I'm giving you a Cliff's Notes version of it. You know, Senate's usually more complicated than that. While he was reading, Gaius Papulus takes his cane, puts it down in the sand, and begins to walk slowly around Antiochus, slowly making a circle. And then, when he completes the circle on the other side, Antiochus says, well, after reading this, I need to consort with my Senate, my guys. He was actually considered himself a basileus, a king. And so I'm going to talk to my guys. And Gaius says, you will not move out of this circle without an answer for Rome. Leaving it is an act of war against Rome. He looks down and he sees the circle. Antiochus does. He starts arguing, you know, the normal thing that people do, arguing, making lots of noise, whatever, but he didn't walk outside the circle. Finally, he says, okay, I will leave Egypt. And that's when Gaius Papulus Lianus reaches his hand out and they shake. Well, 2 years later, Antiochus died due to a coup in his own kingdom. Line in the sand is a term that comes from this situation. It is a line that you do not cross. You've heard that before, right? Sometimes politicians say, I'm putting a line in the sand, and I always wonder, what in the world? Sand moves. That line's going to move. But in the short term, it does not. That line was big, and that is a line that essentially brings out another thing. You shall move up to this point, but after that you shall not what? You've seen this before? Ever see Lord of the Rings? Gandalf, one of the famous scenes, you shall not. That's right, and that's what I heard when I was at school. You shall not pass. Oh, never mind. And all of a sudden, the Balrog, that symbol of evil, stops, cannot move beyond that spell. You shall not pass. The line has been drawn. You are out. You must make a choice today. Turn with me in your Bibles to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. And when you turn in your Bible to John chapter 8, realize this part of the text, actually, we don't know where this comes from in the Bible. I know that sounds weird to say. But there are early versions of the Bible, when I say versions, as in transcripts of the Bible, that have this scenario in the book of Luke, not in the book of John. And the language in which it's written actually doesn't match Johannian writing style. But yet, it was there. And then there were some versions of the book of John that had this text at the end of the book of John, maybe describing what the whole purpose of Jesus' ministry is. Let's read. And it takes us, and that's why you'll have, if you have an NIV or another version that's not like a New King James or King James, sometimes it has a writing in here and says some manuscripts do not include this, right? Do you see that? Okay, so I'm going to start with chapter 7 at the end so we can flow on through. Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, "Why didn't you bring him in?" Talking about the arrest of Jesus. Remember, those in charge of the temple, they were busy wanting to take Jesus down. But Jesus was very hard to take down, for the people loved him. Are you with me on that? It is the people that were his strength. So the purpose of the political establishment was to make Jesus look bad before the people. Then they can execute him at any time. Because as a priest, do you really want to look like you want to kill someone? No, you don't want to look like that. You want to look like you love God and you're doing what's right. By taking Jesus down, we want to be able to seem like we're doing God's will, when in actuality, it was their will that they were trying to execute. Does that make sense? There's always been those in establishment that want to control the narrative. But Jesus, the thing about Jesus, it was very different with Jesus. Jesus actually would always appeal right back. In fact, he would say, "It is written" many times. He knew the Word of God, and he knew the purpose of it. And every time he spoke, the people were blown away because he had authority. And it says this in the book of Mark. He had authority, and not the kind of authority that the chief priests had or the Pharisees. It's authority that came from submission to God. Real power does not come from pushing your agenda. Real power comes from submitting yourself to God. Because then the power of the resurrection becomes your power. Does that make sense? Okay, let's continue reading. Sorry. So they were trying to arrest him. And verse 46, the guards say, "No one ever spoke the way this man does." Did you hear that? See, Jesus had authority. And even the guards say, "Well, I feel bad." No, this guy's good, right? That's always what wins out. When people want to do things that are wrong, they always hide behind things. They'll hide behind committees. They'll have meetings late at night, like the Sanhedrin was when Jesus was condemned. They'll always try to hide things. But people who are transparent and open, on the other hand, Jesus was transparent. In fact, he said that. He says, "You've seen me. Ask people who saw me. I've been speaking openly, not at night." Right? So, we continue on. Verse 47, the priests say, "Do you mean he's also deceived you?" The Pharisees retorted. Verse 48, "Have any rulers of the Pharisees believed in him?" "No, but this mob knows nothing about the law." So they detested the people, didn't they? The people loved Jesus. If only they could get the people to stop liking Jesus, then they can do whatever they want. Let's now move down. Verse 52. They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it." Okay. Then we move to verse 53. Then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of what? Okay, we're together now. All right. Remember, this part of your text now, we're not sure where it fits, but many scholars, as well as one or two versions, have it right here embedded in the book of John at this chapter 8. Let's continue. Verse 2. At dawn, Jesus appeared again at the temple courts. Full stop for a second. Who here has been to a place called Padre Nostra? Have you been there? It's a beautiful place in Israel on the Mount of Olives. When we do tours there, we like to go to Padre Nostra. But it's hard to get there sometimes because there's so many different other things happening. Padre Nostra is a place you go into. You know what Padre Nostra means? Our Father. Our Father. Padre Nostra. You go in and you can see the Lord's Prayer. That's why I love doing the Lord's Prayer. You can see the Lord's Prayer in every language. It's like 53 different languages. It's funny because Anna was there and says, oh, here's Filipino. There's Tagalog. There was a Visayan one too up there. There's Chinese, there's Japanese, there's Mandarin, there's Cantonese. There are different versions of the Lord's Prayer in these beautiful mosaics all through the church around. And then you come to the center of Padre Nostra, and it's a hole in the ground, essentially, into a cave. And you duck down in, and you look at this cave, and that is the place, it's believed, that Jesus stayed with his disciples during the time of the last weekend, the last week, or before. Remember, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head at night. And when you go in there, in this little cave, you say, man, the God of the universe. But here is the place where it is believed that he first recited, Padre Nostra, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. As the disciples are there in this, basically a cleft in the ground. Because in Israel, there's all kinds of caves. Lots of limestone caves everywhere. So at dawn, he gets up. He comes out of the Mount of Olives. He goes down through the valley of the Kidron and then back up toward the temple. He enters the temple early. And this is when the Pharisees and Sadducees say, we got him. We have figured it out. At dawn, he appeared there in the courts where all the people had gathered around him, and they sat down. He sat down to teach them. Verse 3. The teachers of the law and the what? Now, these are the two political parties. Teachers of the law are Sadducees. That's usually the temple. The Pharisees are, it's almost like the religious left and the religious right. Okay? The Sadducees really don't believe in God. But they're the temple, the ones in charge of the temple. They believe in money. They like a G word, gold. And in fact, that was why Jesus came and overturned the money changers. Remember that? You guys believe more in the gold in the temple than the temple itself and the God that made the temple. In fact, Stephen, that's why he got executed. Stephen, 3.5 years later after Jesus ascended, he was killed because of this very thing. He called the temple the golden calf. And believe you me, in the most holy place, there was no Ark of the Covenant, but there was a bank in there. Josephus records it, that's where they were keeping their money, in the most holy place. That's how it worked. Religion has always been a lucrative business. So the Sadducees were more like the left, as we see today. But then there's the right, which is more of the conservative, Bible-banging type that always is pointing the finger all the time at everyone. These two different sides, when it's dangerous, is when both sides come together. Right? Both of them come against Jesus. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a who? Are you with me in the text? Brought a who? A woman, a gune in Greek, a gune. They brought this woman and they throw her down before Jesus. I played with the idea of doing a video today because it's a great cinematic. There's something contrasting when you have a bunch of men that are busy pointing the finger at Jesus and using a woman to do that. Caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this..." Ooh. Man, don't even use her name. This woman was caught in the what? In the what? In the... You mean it was a sting operation? Think about that. Now, historically, we generally interconnect this woman with Mary of Magdala. And we connect it also with the woman who anointed Jesus' feet over at Simon the leper's house, which we're not sure who Simon the leper is, because actually the names sometimes were changed. That's why you cannot find the name of Lazarus anywhere else in the Bible other than in the book of John, because people were still alive. You don't use their real names, right? You use a nickname. That's how it is. And in fact, you'll find this in other places where things are pointed out and things are mentioned, but that name isn't given, or a pseudonym name, because when there's persecution happening in the early church, it puts a death warrant on them, right? So that's what you do. But you tell the story. That is a true story, just using a pseudonym name. So Simon the leper, we're not sure exactly who that was, but he was connected with Mary. In fact, in the story, Ellen White points out that Simon was the reason why she had even gone into the life of sin that she had. In other words, she probably had been molested as a young child. She was someone who had experienced a lot of mess in life because of people using her for whatever reason. All of us, male and female, are like this woman at times. We've gone through things in our lives. We ask the question, why? And yet, sometimes those in authority and those in politics still use us as, don't ever be like this one, right? Little Johnny, don't be like little Johnny. And I was named Johnny. Actually, I was John when I was a kid. Go, little Johnny is always the guy that does something wrong in the old stories. And then you go, wow, am I little Johnny? Maybe I am. You know, well, this woman had been caught. Not just caught, but I think it was a sting operation. For how do you discover some kind of a act like that, committing adultery, without people knowing about it? In fact, she might have even been promised money or given money that came from the treasury of the temple. Did you ever think about that? Wow. How corrupt the system had become. This is why Jesus was turning over the money changers in the temple. My house shall be called a house of what? Prayer, says the Lord. But you have turned it into a den of what? Thieves. It's funny. Times change, but things stay the same, don't they? She had been caught in the very act. Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act. In the law, verse 5, of Moses, he commanded us to stone such a what? To stone such a woman. How does Jesus answer? How would you answer? Now you're in a difficult situation, because if you're Jesus, you know this woman, by the way. You've met her before. If this is Mary of Magdala, you've known her. And in fact, she is mentioned later on. It's in the book of Luke or Mark where it said that 7 demons were thrown out of her. In other words, she continued to go back to the same lifestyle, and then she changed. And you know, coming back is hard. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but have you dealt with alcohol in your life or drugs in your life? falling is something that's typical, but you got to pull back. And Jesus wants you to pull back. He doesn't want you to fall, but, Alcoholics Anonymous is set up to make sure that you change all the actions in your life so that you don't lead yourself again to your habit. In fact, in Alcoholics Anonymous, don't even go down the same streets where your bar is you used to go to. Change your location, because it'll make you think about what you used to do. Change the music on the radio or on the internet. Change it. Why? Because you are doing things listening to that, and you will remember, and you will be again pulled to do it yet again. She had fallen over and over, and this time she was in a bear trap because they knew that Jesus knew her. They knew that Jesus would, of course, say, forgive her. But if he says forgive her, what does that tell the people? That the law of Moses is null and void. You don't respect your religion. And Jesus, you've been saying all along that you love God, but you can't follow the law. You say you're so good, but you can't do what God obviously asked you to do. Is it real or not? And that's where the people go, I don't know, maybe he, I love Jesus, but he got what he deserved. You know what I mean? That's how normal people are. Then the other ones will say, stop it, you should just throw out the law. But Jesus begins to do something very important. Let's read here. Don't forget about the line in the sand, because we're about to come to it. For the line is about to be drawn. They were using this question. Now, let me go back to the question. In the law of Moses, they said, meaning the Pharisees, the left and the right, said this together in unison, right? They're all after Jesus. In the law of Moses, as he commanded us to do to such a woman, now what do you say? She needs to be stoned. You know what stoning is? It's not when you smoke a joint. That's not what we're referring to. But to take a rock and take multiple people and pellet that person until they're gone. It's terrible. Take them outside the city and execute them. In the desert, when you're trying to build a nation based on morals, they had to make choices like that. But that does not mean when someone is stoned that God does not love them. I believe there are many people who have been executed that we will see in heaven. One of them is a thief on the cross. Remember him? Father, or should I say Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, you will be with me in paradise. So don't judge things on the outside. Let God deal with judging. But Jesus is here, and he's having to deal with the law of Moses, and he's having to deal with this woman that he knows had a horrible life, trying to fix it, and continues to find herself in difficult circumstances. And now she's in the middle of this crux, and the politicians could not care less about her. All they care about is using her as a tool to get to him. Evil uses its love against you. Evil, listen to me. Evil people will use your love against you. That's just how they are. That's narcissism. Jesus at this time bent down and started to what? Actually, the word write is not the word used, it's inscribe. I love the line, but it gets more complicated. We're going to see that very soon. Have you ever seen Passion of the Christ? powerful scene in it when he puts his finger down. And this is in a flashback through the time when Jesus is being whipped and Mary sees him and she remembers what he did for her. And he puts his finger down, and this is so Mel Gibson dramatic. He puts his finger down, and it's almost like the sand explodes. As he's doing his finger, the sand is coming up like this in slow motion. He's putting the line in the sand. This far and no further. He begins to write on the ground with his finger, the finger. When you talk about the law of Moses, Jesus, his prototype, before he was born as Jesus in human flesh, he's referred to in the Old Testament as Yahweh. And that was the finger of Yahweh that wrote the Ten Commandments. That finger that said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," is the very finger that writes the line in the sand to protect someone who committed adultery. This is one story we're talking about, my friends, not two stories. He writes in the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he then straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you," and I should have had a stone up here. Lift that. I like Greatest Story Ever Told, where he has, here's a stone. "Who of you is without sin? Cast the first stone." And he goes up to one of these Pharisees that's standing there like this. He goes up to him, and the Pharisee, maybe he even went to the guy who was actually in the bed with her. Who knows? Who had maybe paid her some money so that they could get caught in the act and use her to destroy Jesus. That's how politics works, doesn't it? It's sad, but it's true. This is why we have to have Jesus in our hearts. Because without Jesus, religion becomes a cesspool of garbage. Without Jesus, religion becomes just another building that is hollow and never will grow, and nothing will come out of it that is good. But Jesus enters, and something happens. Those who don't love Jesus will run away, and those who do are attracted to Jesus will come. It is that simple. My sheep hear my voice. That's what he said, right? My sheep hear my voice, and they will come. And there will be one shepherd of one sheep pen. And there are others, he says. There are others that are not in the sheep pen, and I will call them also. By the way, he's talking about the non-Adventist and the non-Jewish out there, right? Because he calls all of us, every one of us. He then says, who has the ability to say you're without sin? Here's your stone. I have something else to show you. I will move my cane. Don't you love this awesome cane? All right. It reminds me every day of where I'm heading. Unless Jesus comes again soon. But I need to put my Bible down here. Forgive me. Because I can then have two hands. Take a look at this. You know what this is? Can you see yourself in it? Let's see online. You're going to see a camera. Ooh, isn't that awesome? You can kind of see it, right? This is a mirror of the ancient world. Do you know that? This is why Paul says in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, today you only see in a mirror darkly. It means you look, but it really doesn't. It's like, wow, I hope I look okay. My makeup is kind of, and my friend says, oh, it's wrong. It's wrong. The lady, your mascara is, but it looked okay, right? But today you see in a mirror darkly. But then in heaven you shall see like face to face. It's like our mirrors today, which you can see. Sometimes I don't want the mirror as good. I like how I look in this. I look a lot more handsome when I see this mirror than a real mirror. Jesus was showing a mirror to these men. You are not as cool as you think you are. And they knew that. They knew that. In fact, that's the Caligula effect. The Caligula effect is political leaders, because they're in charge and have power, they feel like they can do anything, and no one, you can even, in front of people, do something wrong and no one should say anything about it. Because you're powerful, you're Machiavelli, you can say anything you want, right? But Jesus was showing the mirror to these people. My friends, have you ever looked in the mirror? There are so many people that are trying to meet Jesus today. And sometimes we judge them because of what we're used to, because of what we want. Just a point. Let's continue. Jesus does the line in the sand, and then he begins to write. And this is the part when it gets more complicated. Any one of you who is without sin, be the first to throw a stone at her. Verse 8. Again, then, he stooped down to the ground and wrote on the ground. What happens next? At this, those who heard began to walk away, or go away one at a time. First, the who? So the older ones had done worse things than the younger ones. They'd been around longer to mess up a lot longer. The older ones have more to lose, by the way, than the younger ones. You could always say, oh, Pastor John is young. Well, actually, I'm not young anymore. I have white things. You can screw up. So I'll say that to my son. Pastor John can screw up. That's okay. But Pastor Old John, I'm not so sure he can screw up. Because everyone will remember that. The older ones say, I'm out of here. In fact, as he's writing, Ellen White likes to say that he was writing the sins of her accusers in the sand. Maybe even making dates when these guys met with her for money. Who knows? Before you accuse, take into account the love of Jesus. The older ones start to leave, and then what's the next one? I know it's getting long. I promise you we're going to be done soon. All right. So, she says, each one started to go away, the older ones first, until only Jesus and the woman were still standing there. Jesus straightened up, standing back up at verse 10, and asked her, Woman, where are your accusers? Has no one here condemned you? How do you like that? Verse 11, she says, no one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you. Then he declared, go your way, and I'm going to do the King James, and sin no more. Now, some people say that means you better be perfect when you know Jesus. You better not sin again. That's the unpardonable. You're gone. It's not what he was saying. Think about it for a second. He was on the ground, writing in the dirt. He stands up, and then he says, reach for the stars. Have you been condemned by others around you? Have you experienced where others that are worse than you point their finger at you and tell you you're dirt? I got good news for you. You can reach for the stars.